Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may the peace and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon our last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, but also upon his righteous companions, his noble family, and all of those who follow the path of truth, insha'Allah. That is all of us who are here tonight. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we heard in the short introduction, my name is Brother Yusuf Yee. And yes, I was the Muslim chaplain, the U.S. Army Muslim chaplain who served down in Guantanamo Bay in late 2002 and 2003. And today I'd like to share with you my story and my experiences. But let me begin just by giving you a short background of myself. I'm a third generation Chinese American, third generation. My grandparents came here to America. My parents were born here in the United States, as well as my two younger brothers and two older sisters. I'm former military, former chaplain, former captain, former soldier of the U.S. Army. Served in two of our nation's conflicts, first in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, and then in what's known today as Operation Enduring Freedom. I'm a West Point graduate. I graduated from the United States Military Academy, West Point. But not only am I military, former military, but the military is now rather rooted in my family. My younger brother is also a West Point graduate. My other younger brother is a doctor, an Army doctor, and he's actually serving right now in Iraq. My father also served in the military. He was drafted during World War II. So all of the men, all of the males in my family have served in the military and has made individual contributions towards protecting the country. But not only am I former military, third generation Chinese American, but I'm also Muslim convert. After being raised Lutheran, Christian. I converted to Islam back in 1991. Shortly after graduating West Point. And of course, that's one of the most essential part of my life experience, because then I would become a Muslim chaplain to serve within the ranks of our military. And that would happen in January of 2001. After I had served a number of years as an air defense artillery officer, I left active duty and would return to the ranks of our military a few years later, but this time as a chaplain, a Muslim chaplain. This was in January of 2001. At one time, I had actually hoped that I might be the first Muslim chaplain, because when I converted to Islam, I was in the military and we didn't have any Muslim chaplains. We had Jewish chaplains, we had Christian chaplains, but there weren't any Muslim chaplains. And this was around the time of the first Gulf War, when the numbers of Muslims were actually increasing very rapidly. And actually, from the first Gulf War, I had heard that maybe 5,000, maybe 7,000 of our troops converted to Islam during that time. I was one of them in that very same time frame. But we didn't have Muslim chaplains then, and I thought maybe one day I would be the first. But when I came back on active duty in January of 2001, I wasn't the first. I was the newest Muslim chaplain, but I wasn't the first. We already had one or two Muslim chaplains in the Navy, one or two in the Army, and even now a small handful of Muslim chaplains in the ranks of our Army. But in January 2001, as I said, I was the newest. And in that very same year, we all know what happened just 9 months later. September of 2001, September 11th, the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon. There was another flight, United 93. That one would crash in Pennsylvania. All happened, we know, on September 11th. And at that time, I was a Muslim chaplain representing Islam and representing Muslims in the military. And immediately following those attacks, of course, I was someone who had stated publicly that those who carried out these attacks, whether they were Muslim or whether they weren't Muslim, should be brought to justice. Why? Because innocent civilians had been targeted and killed. But also immediately following these attacks, I was approached by senior level leaders within the military, especially on the base where I was stationed, and that was in Washington State, Fort Lewis. And these military leaders approached me, first my battalion commander, and then others, asking me if I would begin holding training sessions, lectures, briefings about Islam, about the Muslim culture for our troops, for those who were serving in our armed services. And I did that. And I would answer the many questions that these soldiers had about Islam, and they had many. They had many questions about Islam following 9/11. Many Americans had questions about Islam following 9/11, but I was speaking to those who were serving in our armed forces. And as a result, many of them came away with a better understanding of our faith, of our culture. And I began to receive praise and recognition. I was being characterized as someone who was building bridges of understanding, educating our troops about Islam and the Muslim culture. And I look back now and speculate that maybe I was asked to do this. Why? Because our military leaders knew following 9/11 that our soldiers were going to be deployed. To where? To Muslim nations, Muslim countries like Afghanistan, and then Iraq, and then the many other Muslim countries where we find American soldiers today. And if we look at where the majority of the soldiers are deployed, where are they? In the Muslim world. But I did, in that immediate post-9/11 aftermath, receive that praise and recognition, because I would also become a point person for the media regarding Muslims and Islam in the military, answering the many questions that journalists had. They wanted to cover American Muslims who were serving in the ranks. And again, I received more praise and recognition from the highest levels in the Pentagon and even in the State Department. And I believe it was that recognition that I had received in the immediate post-9/11 aftermath that got me handpicked, specifically chosen for the assignment down in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to be the Muslim chaplain of this now notorious prison camp. Well, I got those orders in the summer of 2002. And when I got those orders, I began to speculate again behind the reason why I was receiving these orders as a Muslim chaplain to go down to Guantanamo, a place where there are hundreds of prisoners being held, all of them Muslim. And I speculated that maybe the real reason behind me being sent to Guantanamo was so that our country, the United States of America, could say to the world, yes, we do have these hundreds of Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, but we also have our Muslim chaplain who's there to serve their religious needs. And that would be an indication that we as a nation were treating these prisoners humanely, that we were being sensitive to the faith of these Muslim prisoners being held in Guantanamo. I speculated that that was the reason behind me being sent. Maybe that was the reason, or maybe it wasn't the reason. But nevertheless, when I got down to Guantanamo in November of 2002, I quickly learned that I had two roles. The first role was to be an advisor to the camp command on religion, how the religious observances, the religious practices of Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo affected this military detention operation. That was my first role. The second role that I had was to be a chaplain to all the Muslims in Guantanamo. Not only these 660 or so Muslim prisoners, but I was also a chaplain to the many American Muslims down in Guantanamo. Yes, there were also American Muslims in Guantanamo. Not as prisoners, though, as U.S. soldiers who were working for this Joint Task Force operation, or as civilians, American civilians who were also down in Guantanamo working for this Joint Task Force prison operation. So imagine, in the prison population, you had 660 or so Muslims that represented about 40 different countries. Well, how many languages do you think were spoken in Guantanamo? Many languages, from Arabic, Pashto, Farsi, Urdu, Turkish. European languages included French, German, Russian. There was even Chinese. Who handled the linguistic needs of this military operation? translators, American translators. And most of them were American Muslims because of the diverse languages that were spoken in Guantanamo. Well, of course, I was a chaplain to the American Muslims in Guantanamo as well. And they were, of course, the ones who were allowed to go to Jummah prayer on Fridays. Jummah prayer, which I would conduct noon on Friday. It was American Muslims who could attend. But the Muslim prisoners, they were confined to their cells. Their cage-like cells were not allowed to go to Salat al-Jummah. But I was still a chaplain to the Muslim prisoners as well. And in my role as a chaplain to the prisoners, I was one of the few individuals who was actually granted, authorized, unescorted access into the prison cell blocks. I was one of the few individuals who was allowed to speak freely and openly with the Muslim prisoners down in Guantanamo. And what would I hear from them as I listened to them very closely? Lots of things. Stories, their concerns, their complaints about what was going on not only in the prison cell block, but also in the interrogation room. There are two operations in Guantanamo. Detention, which is run by military police and guards who handle the everyday needs of prisoners. They bring the prisoners their meals, their clothing. They escort them to recreation or the showers. That's the detention operation. The other operation is the intelligence gathering operation. The job of the intelligence gathering operation is to extract information from the prisoners if they might have any. Valuable intel. Who's in that operation? Intelligence officers, federal, military, and interrogators. Well, I was assigned directly to the detention operation. Why? Because it would be unethical for a chaplain of any denomination to work with interrogators to extract information from prisoners. So I was far removed from the intelligence operation, assigned alongside the guards, maybe to help relieve much of the tension that existed between the prisoner and guards. Right? But in my role as chaplain to the prisoners, of course, I was able to gain a thorough understanding of what was going on inside these interrogation rooms and what was going on inside these interrogation rooms. Abuse, mistreatment, and a lot of terrible things. What was most disturbing to me was to learn how religion was being used in Guantanamo as a weapon. Religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo. That was disturbing to me as a chaplain. Why? Because the primary role of a chaplain in the U.S. military is what? Is to defend religious freedom, is to help accommodate religious practices. Because we live in a society here in the United States that has what? Separation of church and state. So how is it that American taxpayer dollars pay the salary of religious clergy people working in a federal institution? It's the role of the chaplain to defend that constitutional right to religious freedom. That's the primary role of a chaplain. And we as chaplains, we do that. We defend the religious rights of soldiers who are in the military, of employees who work on military installations, and also of people who are incarcerated or imprisoned by the U.S. military. And so when I was sent to Guantanamo, my primary role was to defend the religious rights of prisoners in Guantanamo. And so it was disturbing when I learned that religion was being used as a weapon. And how was that being done? Let me give you a few examples. First example is something that we actually all heard about in 2005. First, from Newsweek magazine. Newsweek magazine in May of 2005 reported that interrogators in Guantanamo were taking the Holy Quran and were flushing it down the toilet. That was a news report that led to massive riots around the Muslim world in protest of American personnel desecrating the Holy Quran. Newsweek later had to retract that report because they couldn't verify the specifics in that article. But what they got right was that the Quran was being desecrated. Maybe the interrogator, they couldn't confirm, was flushing it down the toilet, but what they did get right was that the Quran was being desecrated in Guantanamo in many ways. And I can confirm that because I was there. It happened with guards when they searched the cells. Of course, in any prison operation, there's a need for security, a need to search the cells. But when they came to the Quran, and every cell had a Quran, every prisoner was allowed to have a Quran, sometimes it was the Quran's pages that would end up being torn or ripped, or the bindings being cracked. And when the guards finished searching the Qurans, what did they do? Recklessly tossed them on the floor, went to their next item. Now the prisoners, of course, lived in these open-aired cell-like cages, and they could observe the guards as they conducted their search. And as the Qurans were tossed on the floor, of course, Muslim prisoners became furious, and they protested. They rioted from within their own cells. But what could they do besides bang on their beds and bang on their steel doors? But they then turned to more extreme measures of protest, like going on hunger strike, suicide attempts, trying to kill themselves, like trying to hang themselves in their cell in protest of how the Holy Qurans were being abused and disrespected. And those more extreme measures of protest happened when it was learned that interrogators were taking the Quran into the interrogation room, and in front of that shackled prisoner, they would slam it on the ground. They would step on it. They would kick it across the floor. They would sit on the Quran. And now, even if you look at the investigations into abuses of Qurans that were carried out by the command, the investigations that were carried out by the command, what do they show? That even at some point, Qurans were urinated on by U.S. personnel. Why? Because they knew that Muslims believed that the Quran is the words of Allah, the literal words of Allah. And they exploited our beliefs of Islam in order to try and break these prisoners. But instead it was counterproductive because it ended up in chaos in the prison cell blocks. It ended up stopping any flow of communication between interrogator and prisoner. It was a problem for everyone. It was a problem for the guards who couldn't control the prisoners. It was a problem for the intelligence because prisoners wouldn't talk. But the intelligence also understood something else. What if one of the prisoners ended up killing himself? What would that mean? Well, to the intelligence officers, it meant that that prisoner could no longer be considered an intelligence asset. Meaning what? You couldn't interrogate that prisoner anymore if he was dead. So, of course, they wanted to solve this problem. And one of the things they did was they would turn to me and ask me, what should they do? I, of course, would author some policies in Guantanamo prohibiting any non-Muslims from touching the Qurans in the cell blocks. And that at least helped relieve some of the tension. But the point of desecrating the Quran intentionally to break the prisoners was a way in which religion was being used as a weapon down in Guantanamo. What's another way in which religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo? They would exploit another aspect of our culture. Like when you go into any Islamic center, in any masjid, you find a separation between the genders and the sexes. Men in one area, women in the other. In a conservative Islamic society, of course, maybe you don't even find physical handshaking between men and women out of modesty for each other, right? U.S. personnel in Guantanamo recognized this aspect of our culture. And they knew that many of the prisoners in Guantanamo came from conservative Islamic countries. And this was an interrogation operation that had pressure on it right from the Secretary of Defense himself to get information from these prisoners in any way you can. So it was a very competitive interrogation process, one that involved men and women interrogators. But the women interrogators, they felt that, hey, maybe we have an advantage over our male counterparts. And what was that advantage? Their sexuality. Some of them were very ready to take a prisoner into the interrogation room. She would strip off her clothes and stand naked in front of this Muslim male prisoner, thinking that would break him. Especially if he's never been married. Maybe he's never seen a naked woman before. She would go further. She would inappropriately rub her own body on this shackled prisoner who couldn't resist. And again, even if you look at the investigations into abuses of prisoners in Guantanamo, they also suggest that some of these female interrogators even grabbed the genitals of Muslim male prisoners in Guantanamo. This was degrading not only to Muslim prisoners, but in my view, degrading to them women themselves for carrying out this type of behavior. Degrading to all women, as they were presenting themselves merely as a sex object in front of Muslim prisoners. Not an appropriate way to look at any woman in any society merely as a sex object. So this was degrading in any which way you look at it. There were other ways in which religion was being used as a weapon, like when prisoners described for me an interrogation room that had a large circle marked on the floor, a large circle. And in the center of that circle, they told me that there was a symbol, a marked symbol, and that marked symbol was a star, satanic star. The pentagram symbol that represents Shaitan was in the center of that circle. And what did they do? These interrogators, they recognized that Muslims what? Believe in La ilaha illallah. That we believe in one God. Tawheed. They recognized that and wanted to exploit our belief because they took the Muslim prisoner and they put him in the center of this satanic circle and they attempted to force him to bow down and prostrate, to make sujood or ruku' in the center of this satanic circle while they screamed at this Muslim that Satan is your God now, not Allah. They were attacking our faith. They were attacking these Muslims for their faith in Allah to try and break them. But there were many other ways in which religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo. Sometimes Muslims down in Guantanamo got their beards forcefully shaven because they knew many Muslims considered wearing a beard an obligation, a wajib. Some of the prisoners experienced in the interrogation room, interrogators would come in and dress up as Catholic priests, and they would forcefully baptize some Muslim prisoners saying, "You're not Muslim anymore, I just baptized you as a Christian." Sometimes they took the Israeli flag, which has a religious symbol on it, the Star of David, and they would wrap it around the prisoner, thereby desecrating a Jewish symbol. Right? There was many ways in which religion was being used as a weapon down in Guantanamo. And these were things that I would hear about not only from prisoners, but also from many of the translators, the American translators who worked inside these interrogation rooms would come to me and say, "Look, chaplain, these are some of the things that are going on. You have to bring it to the command." And I did. I raised concerns about many of these things to my chain of command in the detention side of the operation. But I would raise concerns about many other things, like the conditions. Why were these prisoners being held in these cell-like cages, being treated more like animals? I raised concerns about the ages of some of the prisoners. Well, what does age have to do with anything in a prison operation? Well, to me, I thought it was a concern because I came across prisoners who were as young as 12 years old. There were 12-year-old boys in Guantanamo who our government were calling terrorists. Right? I raised concerns about many of these things. And actually, I believed it was right for me to raise concerns because when I saw, especially how religion was being used as a weapon, I believed that went against our values as a nation. Our nation defends religious freedom like in the First Amendment of our Constitution. The Pilgrims, when they came and landed on Plymouth Rock, they were looking for religious freedom. That was the first cause here in the West, religious freedom. But now instead the tables are turned. And U.S. personnel in Guantanamo was using religion as a weapon to humiliate, to degrade, to attack individuals. In my view, this was against national values, Army values, and my values as an American citizen, as a Muslim, and as an officer in the U.S. Army. And when I raised concern to my chain of command, I actually believed that my chain of command on the detention side valued my input. They began to get an understanding of why the prisoners reacted, why they rioted, why they caused disturbances, and the guards couldn't control them because of how they were being abused. And my chain of command would give me awards down in Guantanamo. I got an officer evaluation report, the best that I had ever received in my entire career for the 10 months I was in Guantanamo. I got something else which I thought was an award. In the military, we call it R&R. What's R&R? Rest and relaxation. That's for those soldiers who are deployed for a lengthy period of time. Sometimes they get R&R, meaning they can go home. They can see their family, visit with them for 2 weeks, but then they have to return back to their military mission. After 10 months in Guantanamo, I got R&R. I got on a plane to come back to the U.S. to visit my family back in Washington State. The plane landed in Jacksonville, Florida. I had a connecting flight, which I was supposed to catch and then go to Seattle. But I never made that connecting flight. Because when the plane landed in Jacksonville, I was met by some people. First, there was immigration officers and customs officials. And I remember the immigration officers came on the plane and checked everyone's ID before we even stepped off. And I thought this was routine. Coming back in the country, they wanted to make sure everyone had the proper ID. But now I look back and know that it wasn't routine because they were looking for someone. It was me. Because as soon as I came off that plane, the customs officials came to me and said, "We want to search your bags." Well, they searched my backpack and 2 duffel bags that I had checked. And in the back room, they would say that I was carrying some suspicious documents. They said I had some suspicious documents. They didn't know what they were. They just said they were suspicious. And then all of a sudden, there were intelligence officers in the room. Immediately, Army counterintelligence, naval criminal investigators like NCIS. FBI was there. 2 FBI agents were there, all in an instant. And I was amazed how they got there so quick. Well, of course, they were there waiting for me. It was a sting operation. And then they would make these claims that I had classified information. And then they got an arrest warrant. And they threw me in jail. They arrested me in secret. I never got on that connecting flight, never got back to Seattle. Nobody knew what had happened to me. It was like I had disappeared. My family had no idea what had happened. My wife was worried. She called my parents in New Jersey to see if maybe they heard something from me. They hadn't heard a thing. Nobody knew where I was. But they learned where I was. 10 days later, they learned of where I was. The same day everyone else learned. And that was when I was the headline of the day. That the Muslim chaplain from Guantanamo Bay had been arrested, and I was being accused of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, and that I was now sitting in a maximum security prison in Charleston, South Carolina. I was in a prison known as the Consolidated Naval Brig, a place where our government was housing U.S. citizen enemy combatants. Foreign enemy combatants, we know, are in Guantanamo Bay and in other CIA black sites. But if you happen to be declared an enemy combatant and are a U.S. citizen, you get sent to Charleston, South Carolina, the Consolidated Naval Brig. That's where they sent me. But I'll tell you, after they sent me there, the U.S. military said in a media interview that me being sent to this prison where there were other people there like Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, others who were declared U.S. citizen enemy combatants, they said me being sent there was only a coincidence. No way was it a coincidence. Why? Because when they transported me there from Jacksonville, they shackled me up at the wrist and at the waist, at the ankles, just like the way they shackle prisoners in Guantanamo. And they actually say that when you get shackled in this manner, it's in a 3-piece suit. They say, put them in a 3-piece suit. And when I heard that, I thought they were going to get a suit from, one like you buy from the mall, made by Armani. But no, it wasn't a 3-piece suit like that. It was a 3-piece suit of chains, where I was shackled in 3 places, just the way they shackled prisoners in Guantanamo. But when they put me in the back of that truck, next to an armed guard, 2 other armed guards in the front, the armed guard next to me, what did he do? He took out of his bag these plastic goggles, and they were painted black. And what did he do? He put those goggles on my eyes so I couldn't see anything. Then he took out of his bag these heavy industrial type ear devices which go over the ears, prevented me from hearing. So I couldn't see anything and I couldn't hear anything. I was shackled like a prisoner from Guantanamo. I was being subjected to something that's called sensory deprivation. That's what it's called, sensory deprivation. And it's done to instill fear and intimidation and confusion. But guess what? Well, I knew about sensory deprivation. Down in Guantanamo Bay, that's how they treated the prisoners. And that was fearful, because I knew that our government at that time, the Bush administration, was saying that these prisoners down in Guantanamo who are subjected to sensory deprivation, they don't have any rights. So when I find myself being treated in the same way, I'm fearing that my government now is stripping from me all of my rights. It didn't matter that I was a U.S. citizen. I recognized that I was being treated like an enemy combatant. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know where they were taking me. Hours later, they threw me in this cell, single solitary cell in Charleston, South Carolina. I was in that cell for 76 days. 76 days I was in that cell, isolated, while the media was reporting that I was this terrorist spy. And even in the news, some of the headlines, like in New York, were saying that I could be the first military academy graduate convicted of treason. That's what was being said of me. And even I was threatened with the death penalty in the first few days of my arrest. Military prosecutors threatened me with the death penalty for these heinous crimes that they wanted to charge me with. But you know what? Out of those 76 days, 30 of them was in the month of Ramadan. I spent the entire month of Ramadan in a single isolated cell by myself. They took away from me the blessing of being able to break fast with my family or with the community, of praying side by side in Jama'ah, of praying Taraweeh in Jama'ah, and the blessings of congregational prayer. Instead, I was in this cell by myself, isolated. But it was my faith in Islam and my faith in Allah which carried me through that time. My faith was never shaken during that time. Alhamdulillah. And I remember taking inspiration from the verse that we heard in the introduction. الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. I remember reading the Quran and taking inspiration from that ayah, where Allah says that for Muslims, that whenever we're subjected to a great calamity or difficulty, that all we should do is say, to Allah we belong, and to Him, inshallah, we shall return. But I took other inspiration from different verses in the Quran, like when Allah says, وَاسْتَعِينُوا بِالصَّبْرِ وَالصَّلَاةِ, that we should seek the help in Allah in patience and perseverance, and also in our salah. What else could I do in that prison cell except trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Trust Him and make my salah in that cell. They couldn't prevent me from making my salah, even if they wouldn't tell me which way was the Qibla, even if they wouldn't give me the prayer times. They couldn't prevent me from making my salah. I remember just submerging myself during that time, nothing to do except make dhikr. Recite over and over the dua, and we all know it. Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakil. That for me as a Muslim, Allah Azza wa Jal alone in this life is enough. Allah is enough. Because He, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the best disposer of all of our affairs, the best planner. And I remember the verse, Asa an takrahu shay'an wa huwa khayrun lakum. That maybe you hate something, maybe you dislike something, but in it, there's much good. And as much as I hated being called a terrorist spy, being thrown in solitary confinement, being subjected to sensory deprivation, being separated from my family, being accused of being a terrorist, I recognize that Allah is the best planner and that there must be some divine wisdom in what was happening. So that's where my trust was. That is where my faith was. And it was only through faith that I was able to actually maintain some type of sanity during those 76 days of isolation. But alhamdulillah, after 76 days, I was suddenly released. Was not charged with these heinous crimes that they were accusing me of. Yeah, they did try to charge me with lesser offenses, like mishandling classified documents. That's what they called it. And they tried to court-martial me. They tried to try me, keep me in jail, hold me accountable. I was still facing about 13 or 14 years in prison. By this time, I've now been able to retain an attorney, a military law expert, to defend me. And in this pretrial hearing, the first thing we did was we demanded that the government turn over any review, official review, to show that I indeed had something that was classified, to substantiate these now lesser charges of mishandling classified information. But they, in fact, had never even conducted a review of anything that they had seized from me. So the judge was like, delay this hearing. Then it got delayed again and again, while months of investigation took place. And then what happened next? All the charges were dropped. They were dropped on March 19th. 5 years ago yesterday, all the charges against me were dropped. I was sent back to Fort Lewis. Later, my record was wiped clean. I was reinstated as a Muslim chaplain. How long do you think it took before I resigned my commission? It was very quick. And when I left the military in January of 2005, I got an honorable discharge. An honorable discharge. And I also got a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for, quote, exceptionally meritorious service. I even got a second Army Commendation Medal. How do you figure that out? It was a miscarriage of justice, a gross miscarriage of justice. And why did this happen? Because I'm Muslim in the dangerous post-9/11 era where we know Muslims in this country have been profiled, discriminated against, and looked at first as a terrorist rather than a loyal citizen. It didn't matter that I was a West Point graduate, that my brothers served in the U.S. military, that my father served in World War II, that I served in the First Gulf. What mattered to some in Guantanamo was that I was Muslim, that when I read the Quran in the Arabic language, when I made my salah, praying, bowing, prostrating, making sujood, that it was the same way that the prisoners were praying. To them, it meant that I was also the enemy. Did it happen because I'm Chinese? When I learned later that someone had said of me, quote, who the hell does this Chinese Taliban think he is? Telling us how to treat our prisoners. Someone called me a Chinese Taliban. Not just Taliban, but a Chinese Taliban. Someone was disturbed by my ethnic background of being Chinese. Did this happen because I was raising concerns about what was going on in Guantanamo? The abuse of prisoners, religion being used as a weapon, 12-year-old prisoners being held in Guantanamo in conditions that were cage-like, where you might think this was suitable for an animal, not human beings? Sure, raising concerns about potential war crimes was threatening to those who were carrying out that conduct. They wanted me off that island. Well, they got me off that island. Well, alhamdulillah, I'm here to tell my story. Alhamdulillah. And many people were making dua for me during that time. And verily, Allah answered those prayers. And I was cleared. Got an honorable discharge. And then would go on, document my story, write about it. And then now I'm going around and speaking about it. I think it's clear why President Obama wants to close this place down. Within 2 days of his presidency, what did he do? He signed the executive order to close Guantanamo within a year. I'm actually advocating that he close it sooner rather than later. Why wait a year? It should be done now. Even Colin Powell had said that if it was up to him, he wouldn't close Guantanamo tomorrow. He'd close it this afternoon. That's something Colin Powell said. But you've heard about Guantanamo, and I've told my story. But let's look at what Guantanamo looks like. I have a couple images, some pictures that I want to show you of what Guantanamo looks like and describe them for you. Let me describe for you some facilities in Guantanamo. Okay? This is Camp Delta. This is where I was assigned. Okay? This is how prisoners were first transported to Guantanamo. You can see hooded, it's strapped. And look what's hanging over their head, the American flag, right? This tells the world that this is the United States of America. Closer look at being transported to Guantanamo. This is a picture of Camp X-Ray. It was the first prison camp opened in January of 2002, January 11th. And actually, this was a picture that was released by our government, by the Pentagon, in an attempt to persuade the international community that we were treating prisoners humanely. Wow. But when the world saw this, especially in Europe, of course, the headlines were immediately the following day, torture. Camp X-Ray was made of chain link fences, very makeshift, temporary. Okay. That's a closer look at sensory deprivation. See the goggles and those things over the ears? I was subjected to this, sensory deprivation, but minus the mask on the face, on the mouth. They didn't put a mask on my mouth. But some would say that the reason for the mask was because the individuals who were being sent to Guantanamo were so dangerous that they would chew through the hydraulic lines of the planes to bring it down. So we better cover their mouths, right?
Incredible.
Yeah. Here we see a prisoner being escorted to Camp X-Ray. That's a picture of Camp X-Ray from the top. Now imagine, this is where they held human beings in these type prison cells made of fence. It looks like a place where, like I said, you would keep animals, not humans. And then Camp Delta opened a couple months later. When I got to Guantanamo, it was Camp Delta that was in operation. Camp X-Ray had already been closed. But the cell blocks in Camp Delta looked like this. There were maybe 19 or 20 of these cell blocks. Each cell block had 48 cells, 24 on one side, 24 on the other, and a long corridor down the middle, like that. You can see on the left-hand side there, each of those doors is one cell, one cage-like cell, made of sturdy steel mesh. And if you go into the cell, that's what it looks like. A small cubicle. But of course, that's what the cell looks like after the military what? Mops the floor and waxes it so it shines, right? Then they take a picture of it. And then the U.S. military will tell the media people, look how good the prisoners got it in Guantanamo. They even have an in-ground toilet that these Muslims are culturally familiar with. They got a water fountain where they can drink from or wash before prayer. Look how good we're treating these prisoners in Guantanamo. That's what the military tells you. We'll give them a game of checkers or a deck of cards so they can pass the time while they're here. A couple extra packets of salt, which helps the food taste a little better. You know what? In Guantanamo, we called these things that were given to the prisoners comfort items. They're called comfort items, you know, like Comfort Inn or something. Like Hotel Guantanamo. Right. No, that's what they got. An empty cell, flimsy plastic mattress. Those comfort items were passed out and given when they cooperated with interrogators or with the guards. And that's the steel mesh I'm telling you about. Much more sturdy. And when you look at this steel mesh, everything just becomes like blurred. You're trying to look through the steel mesh. Your mind is trying to focus on what's behind the steel mesh. But your eyes focus on the steel mesh and it blurs your vision. In Guantanamo, here we see a detainee being escorted. We were directed to call them detainees. Why? Because if we call them prisoners, someone might think that we're talking about prisoners of war. But prisoners of war have rights under Geneva Conventions. But the Bush administration had said, no, these prisoners in Guantanamo don't have rights. Call them detainees. Camp 4. This was a medium security facility that was built when I was down there. And it actually housed groups of 10 in one room, if they were very well behaved. But the prisoners, when I visited them in these rooms, they said, look, this is just like solitary confinement. Don't kid yourself. Except I do have 9 of my friends here in the room with me. Very few individuals ever got to Camp 4. And those that did, they didn't have to wear those orange jumpsuits anymore. They got these white uniforms. But this was the only place where prisoners in Guantanamo were allowed to pray together in Jama'ah. This was Camp Iguana. This is where those juvenile prisoners were held, juvenile enemy combatants. in this little facility, the 12-year-old, the 14-year-olds. But there were several 15 to 18-year-olds who were held also in general population. They're still considered juveniles under international law. That's one of them. His name is Omar Khadr. He's actually a Canadian citizen. He's still in Guantanamo. He's the last Western citizen still in Guantanamo. He was captured when he was 15. That's a picture of him when he was captured. And see those holes in his shoulder? That's not where bullets entered his body. That's where they came out, which tells you what? Shot in the back. Right? He was 15. He's still in Guantanamo. Yeah, they saved his life after they shot him up like that, but he's still in Guantanamo, accused of having killed an American soldier. They say when they raided this house that he was the only one in there alive. It must have been him who threw this hand grenade out and killed the soldier. There's actually new evidence that has come out that contradicts that there were others inside that house. I saw that young kid on a daily basis when he was in the hospital in Guantanamo and many times in his cell. Camp Echo was much more isolated. If you were put in Camp Echo, you didn't have any other human contact and you couldn't even see sunlight. You never came out for any reason. Not even to go to interrogation. You can see the interrogation room next to the cell. The interrogator could come to him. But now there's also Camp 5 in Guantanamo. Look at this. This is a permanent prison facility down in Guantanamo. This did not exist when I was there. It was built subsequent. Cement block floors, steel doors. It has about 100 cells. If you go into this maximum security prison, this is what the cell looks like. A little bit claustrophobic. Just a little bit. But there's also Camp 6 that was built. 2-tier. It's got about 200 cells. And my understanding is most of the prisoners have been moved out of the cage-like cells into these isolated cells of solitary confinement here in Camp 5 and 6. Okay? That's an interrogation room, an empty room with a chair and a D-ring on the ground where they would be short-shackled in a catcher-like position, hands behind the calves, in what's known as a stress position for hours as they got interrogated. Yeah, there's a detainee hospital for medical treatment. Yeah, the military and our government brags about the new dental chair they got down there, the cutting-edge medical technology. They say, we've even performed an open-heart surgery on one of the prisoners. But they don't tell you about these. They got these down in Guantanamo. These are known as force-feeding chairs. And what are these for? Those are for the prisoners who are on hunger strike, whose bodies have deteriorated to 70 pounds because they rather die than to be in Guantanamo. And the ones that are there now, are still there. It's going on 8 years now. 8 years. Guantanamo opened in January of 2002. But they get put in these chairs. They're strapped so they can't resist. And then they take a plastic tube. They lube it with petroleum jelly like Vaseline. And they shove it in the prisoner's nose into his stomach, and then they force feed him with a liquid diet so that he doesn't die. Most of the world say that this is actually against world medical ethics to keep someone alive who's on hunger strike. Okay. Sami al-Hajj, remember him? The Al Jazeera cameraman who was in Guantanamo? He was on hunger strike for a long time. When he was in Guantanamo, he drew a picture of what it was like for him to be on hunger strike and to be force-fed. And this is the picture that he drew. Actually, that's not the picture he drew. That's a recreation of the picture he drew. Why? Because the original picture that he drew is classified. But his attorney saw it, and then they recreated it. Of course, Sami al-Hajj was released. He's now back with Al Jazeera working in their newly developed human rights department. President Obama, I mentioned earlier, campaigned about closing Guantanamo. These were things he said. He would close Guantanamo, adhere to the Geneva Conventions, ban torture, and whatnot, and we've already seen him move on some of those things. So, my brothers and sisters, that's my story about Guantanamo. I was there. In my view, this is a place that needs to be closed down. The prisoners who were there. Just yesterday, there was news from a Bush administration official. He was the chief of staff to Colin Powell. Just yesterday, he said, guess what? In Guantanamo, there were many innocent people there, and the Bush administration knew it, but they didn't want to release them for fear it would look bad on the administration, and that they kept them there because they thought they could still get information from them, even though they knew they were innocent. This is from a Bush administration official just yesterday was saying this. This is a place that has to be closed down. I believe that one of the reasons why it is still open is that because there hasn't been enough voice from within our country to get it closed down, and as a result, it's still there. I sincerely hope that President Obama comes through and closes this place down, again, sooner rather than later.